right, let's go ahead and get started. So as you all know, we've been having issues with Panopto, and anybody who was here when the guy came to fix it knows that it was clearly nothing I could have figured out, like selecting a microphone. It was something much more complex, like selecting a microphone. So we now have recordings available again. We're not going to have recordings for those 3 or whatever lectures we didn't have it for, but we are back ready to rock and roll on that. We had our exam last time. We still have 1 or 2 students that still need to take the exam, and we'll take it this week. And then we can go over questions from the exam if we so choose. So as a reminder, I'm not going to hand out exams in class for a multitude of reasons, but I do want y'all to come take a look at your exam. Again, it behooves you, especially as we start getting closer to the final exam, to come see what potentially you missed on the exam, to go over the concepts, and also make sure you know it for said final exam. It would have been a lot more helpful if I had finished that second bullet point, or what I meant to say there, was that I'm contemplating making every exam moving forward online with just the Respondus browser lockdown thingamajigger. I'm seeing a shaking of head, which, why I'm bringing this up, is I want y'all's feedback. If you feel strongly one way or the other, speak now.
What's wrong with having it in class?
I mean, there's nothing really wrong with having it in class, but if you don't have to come to class, you then don't have to find a parking spot. It also means you can get your grade essentially immediately rather than waiting for me to grade it. It also means I don't have to grade it. I can automate that process. What about Scantrons? And we can do that, but then there's always issues of people who like bubble in a couple answers or didn't fully erase the other one. If you have a strong held view about taking it on paper, we can absolutely do that.
I was just asking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't download Respondus on my computer.
Okay. Why is that?
I have a Chromebook, so you can't download anything on it.
Really?
So if we would have to like have a library.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. Yeah.
From a cybersecurity point, I refuse to take an exam on lockdown.
Okay. Why?
Because it is, by definition, by very definition, it is ransomware.
You're not wrong. Actually, you are wrong because you're not paying to get your materials back.
Remind me
So,
how much this class costs?
no, I totally get it. I totally get it. Is that something y'all have to pay for? It's not something that
I
UAH.
don't have a webcam, so I'm going to have to either come to the UAH lab and get a proctor,
Mhm.
or I'm going to have to come to your office and have you come grade a paint.
Okay. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
I second what she said. I don't have a computer that runs it. So.
Okay. Cool. For the other hands that were kind of going up there, is that the recurring issue? Y'all can't download it? Yes.
Why don't you just put it online without using Respondus?
You know the answer to that one. Yeah.
Personally, for me, it's easier to look at paper than at a computer for a test.
Okay.
It's also less stressful.
Why is it less stressful?
It's just, Respondus is kind of intense. You just have to like keep looking at the webcam or like,
Yeah.
it says to keep your face in frame, so
Yeah.
it's kind of scary.
All right. Well, we'll figure it out. But it seems like general consensus is people don't want to do that online. So, for a multitude of reasons. One being computer, the other is ethical reasons. So, all right. So, I think it's stupid that we make y'all wait until the end of the semester to provide feedback on classes because it didn't do y'all any good. You've already finished the class. And so, as part of an extra credit assignment, I was going to do this with a clicker, but Turning Point, or Turning whatever it is, Technologies, limits the amount that you can actually type into those answers. So, pull out a piece of paper, write your name on it if you want the extra credit. If you want it to be anonymous, you can do that as well. But provide 3 different categories. It's going to be start, stop, continue. Start, things that I'm not doing you want me to be doing. Stop, things I am doing that you want me to stop doing. And continue, things that I'm doing that you want me to continue doing. try to make it at least somewhat constructive. Saying I don't want to take exams anymore is not a constructive feedback, since we're still going to be taking exams, even if you don't like the method by which I'm giving those exams. And yeah, again, provide feedback. If you want to make it anonymous, you can do that. Or if you want to just provide feedback now and then make anonymous feedback later to tell me that you hate me, you can slide it under my door or email it to our staff assistant in the front office or any of that stuff. So take a minute or two to write it down and then pass it up front. Also, is there a Jake Davenport in here? No. Do any of y'all know a Jake Davenport? No. Okay. Never mind. Question. Once you're done, pass it up, or make it into a full paper airplane and throw it at me. No. Please don't throw your papers at me. What's that? and reasonable, I will do my best to make the changes. If there are consistent pieces of feedback that are not feasible to make, I will at least address why I'm not making those. Again, if you wrote things like we're not taking exams anymore, we are still taking exams. Every time I do this, somebody says, start bringing in your dogs to class. That's not going to happen. So if you wrote that, I'm sorry. We can just skim that off at pass. But I will do my best to incorporate the feedback again where it is, thank you, logical, sensical, and does not interfere with some sort of pedagogical principles that I or the science have. So, any questions, concerns, comments, declarations, aphorisms, truthisms? Nothing? Cool. Here's your fun fact of the day. Jay was apparently slang for a foolish person. So when pedestrians ignore street signs, they were a quote-unquote jaywalker, a foolish person. How about that? The end. Here's a second fun fact, because today's voting day in Alabama. Do you know who the only president to never be elected as president or vice president was?
Washington?
No, not Washington. Washington was elected. Ford. Did you? You didn't say it loud enough. Doesn't count. No credit. He was Speaker of the House when Spiro Agnew had to resign because of corruption, and he became vice president. And then Nixon Watergated himself, and so he took over as president after that. So, there's your fun fact of the day. All right, so today we are talking about development and early childhood. We've talked a little bit up to this point about neural development, the pairing of synapses, synaptogenesis, things like that. But we're born with very primitive neural networks. We're actually designed to, after being born, continue to develop these synapses, these connections. And that's why human babies are so relatively useless right after they're born when compared to other animals. And I'm sorry if any of you have newborn, they are useless. They can't walk, they can't do anything. But there's actually really interesting evolutionary reasons for it. Right? If you look at the average hip width, that's hard to say, hip width for women, they're about at the max you can have before you start getting serious issues with hip dysplasia. And so a baby's head is actually designed to be smaller and have that soft spot so the skull is not fully formed so that the birth can happen. But then you have this kind of gestation after birth that allows that brain to increase its size. And from ages 3 to 6, you have substantial frontal lobe development. So frontal lobe right up in the front, just like the name would suggest. That frontal lobe development doesn't actually finish until, for women, about 21 to 23, for men, about 25, 26. That's one of the reasons why things like car insurance tend to be higher, and you tend not to be able to reserve rental cars until you're about 25, with certain exceptions. Because the frontal lobe is involved in kind of that long-term consequential planning. And so these areas associated with thinking, memory, and language are actually the last to develop. And you can chart a baby or a fetus's brain development over time and map it on to kind of the evolutionary brain development. So the areas that develop first in vitro are the ones that would have come about first over the course of evolution. And so we're going to talk about 3 different stage theories. Lawrence Kohlberg's moral development stages, Erik Erikson's psychosocial development. And I told you all about my mix-up of Jean and John, so I refuse to say this first name. But Piaget's cognitive development stages. So we'll start with Kohlberg here. All right, so Kohlberg's talking about moral development and thinks that there are 3 different levels to moral development, or 6 distinct stages. First 2 stages fall into what we call this kind of pre-conventional moral development. You think about young children of having this sort of pre-conditional moral development. It's based entirely on avoiding punishment, focusing on the actual consequences of their actions rather than the intentions. And that second stage is focusing on what right behaviors are purely as it relates to maximizing the utility for the individual. Stages 3 and 4 then get into what we call the conventional levels of, or stages of moral development. Stage 3 focuses on kind of this individuals and social roles. They're a good person, they're a bad person. All right, this is a very dichotomous way of thinking. The world is good and evil. That 4th stage would be kind of the law and order are these highest ideals. You would say that social obedience is kind of the highest thing we should be considering when discussing what is moral, what is amoral, maintaining that functional society. That 5th stage, now in what we call that post-conventional level, fixates on this idea that law is contingent on culture. Right? Different cultures have different laws, and those laws are inherently tied to those cultures. The understanding of the diversity of those values. And then the 6th stage, that kind of highest and final stage of moral development, says Kohlberg, is this kind of development of internal moral principles. And adherence to those moral principles is more important to Kohlberg than is obedience to the law. You have this kind of ground truth of what should be that you hope correlates with the law, but this moral kind of establishment that you are abiding by takes precedent over the law in these cases. And so you may be able to identify your kind of progression through these stages. And I suspect most of y'all are kind of in this post-conventional, at least where, for those of y'all who are thinking about it critically, are in this kind of post-conventional level. And kind of progression into this post-conventional level can be seen as one of the things that marks adolescence, right? It's this kind of rebellion against authority for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that can be seen is you're kind of rebelling in the case of a greater good. Things that you believe transcend the structures of society. So that was Kohlberg. Now we're talking Erik Erikson's psychosocial development. And these psychosocial stages are things that kind of motivate our behavior as it relates to our social interactions. Because we're inherently social creatures, everything here is kind of dichotomized of the ways in which we fit in. So in the first year and a half, infants are primarily focused on sort of that stability of care. Erik Erikson posits this as kind of a trust versus mistrust, reliant on that basic virtue of hope. It's the consistency, it's the stability of surrounding care. The second stage for that next year and a half is kind of this autonomy versus shame, really starting to exhibit the first stages, or the first examples, rather, of personal control. So this is where you may see manifestations of what we call the terrible twos, right? Because these toddlers are now starting to try to develop their own sort of personal control. It's no longer, mom and dad said do this, so I'm going to do this. It's, I have my own say, even though you don't, and I'm going to exercise it. That next stage of 3 to 5 is not necessarily just that assertion of personal control, but it's your assertion of themselves. You're putting yourself in a position to take that initiative. Erikson then talks about stage 4 being industry versus inferiority, which is this fixation on being seen as competent. Right? From 5 to 12, he says what really motivates these kids in their development is their peers' view of their competence in any situation. That's why you may see kids be thrown into hysterics when they're told they're bad at something. It's this fixation on competency. Stage 5 is these kind of teen years, wherein Erikson's suggestion is people are trying to figure out their role. How do they fit in with these different social dynamics, these different cliques? You then, in your young adulthood, have kind of this constant battle between intimacy and isolation. How much are you allowing yourselves to be vulnerable and seek the company of others versus how much are you withdrawing on yourself? You then have in stage 7 kind of what we would colloquially call this midlife crisis of, oh crap, am I still kind of generating these new ideas or experiences? Am I going out of my way to establish that, my life's not over, in a way? And then in stage 8, Erikson talks about ego integrity versus despair. And it's in these late stages of life where people still want to feel like they've got some sort of offering to society. They want to be seen as kind of those wise elders, those folks who have lived experiences that they can share. So we've talked about Kohlberg, we've talked about Erikson, and now talking about Piaget's cognitive development. And Piaget says that the child's mind develops in these two schemas, or these series of stages. First, we assimilate to these new experiences. So something new happens to us, and we learn to become okay with it. We interpret them in terms of our current understanding about the way the world works. And then we're forced to accommodate those. We're forced to bring those new experiences into our world schema. How does this change our world schema? How does this allow us to see the world in a different way? And so these different stages, you can see highlighted up here. The first stage would be that sensory motor, coordination of the senses with motor response. And we'll show examples of that at the very end here. Language used for demand and cataloging, right? Not having complex thoughts or being able to communicate a lot of the complexity there. And then towards the end of this stage is where you get the development of object permanence. So who knows what object permanence is? What is object permanence?
Isn't it like if a parent shows an object to a child and then they tell them like close their eyes and they hide the object behind something, the child's going to look for it because they know it exists even though it's not in front of them?
Yeah, so once you develop that sense of object permanence, you have that understanding that just because you can't see things doesn't mean they cease to exist. Before that, you can literally take something that a kid is fixated on and hide it, and the kid doesn't go look for it. Right? In a kid's mind, it's just completely disappeared. And this is why you'll have sometimes the adorable but somewhat pathetic experience where you've got a really young toddler you put in like a bubble bath, they can't see their legs, and they start freaking out. Because now their mental representation of their body is such that their legs have disappeared. You then have the pre-operational stage. You start developing this sort of symbolic thinking. Not everything is this exact representation. Start developing the use of proper syntax and grammar. It's also where you start getting a lot of the development of imagination. Where you might see an emergence of, for example, imaginary friends. However, at this stage, the abstract thought is still inherently difficult. Yeah?
For object permanence, is that why peekaboo for little kids is so entertaining?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it's entertaining. We'll talk a little bit at the end of this about the development through the early months of when peekaboo kind of becomes a thing for them. My suspicion, and I'm not a developmental psychologist, my suspicion is that they are intrigued by kind of the absurdity of the situation and mimicking a lot of the behaviors, right? You rarely see somebody play peekaboo and just keep kind of a stern face the entire time. Like, that doesn't really elicit much from a kid. It's the mimicry of the smiles and the giggles and the laughter and all that sort of novelty. That's a really good question. You then get to this concrete operational stage. So concepts are tied. So again, these concrete situations. Time, space, quantity, all understood and can be applied, but not necessarily as independent concepts. So kids have a really hard time understanding the difference between, 30 minutes and 3 hours. Right? Everything seems like an eternity for a kid. And then in your formal operations stage, you start developing these theoretical, hypothetical, counterfactual thinking. You're able to start using abstract logic. And so this is why if you ask somebody before this sort of formal operation stage, a metaphor like, why shouldn't people who live in glass houses throw rocks? They're going to give you a very literal answer, right? It's because they're going to break windows. Now, as an adult, you may think that's profound and metaphorical in its own sense, but it's that very absolutist, concrete answer rather than understanding it's a representation of hypocrisy This is also why you tend not to get to maths like algebra until you're 13, 15, after you've already gone through this early development. Because the representation of a number by a letter doesn't make any sense to a kid that has not gone through this sort of formal operation stage. All right, so critical thinking. Talk with your neighbor. What are your thoughts about these different theories? What are some of their strengths? What are some of their weaknesses? And then we'll bring it all together. Seventeen more seconds. All right. What are your thoughts about these different theories? What are some of the strengths or weaknesses you observe? Yeah.
Ethics and morality exactly the same.
Okay, so explain for the rest of us what you mean by.
Specifically, section 6, internal moral principles. Yes,
Mhm.
I agree with that. But I don't see how they, like the obedience and punishment can be considered a moral thing.
Okay, further elaborate.
Because you haven't developed the very sense of something being right because it is right, not because it's comfortable. You don't have that. The only thing you have is current ethics. So
Okay.
This is not a description of moral development. This is a description of how people that are not yet developed apply ethics and morals. It's a top-down description versus a bottom-up derivation.
Are you a philosophy major?
A really weird electrical engineer.
I like it. That's good. What other thoughts do y'all have?
Seems very rigid.
Okay, explain. What do you mean?
Every child's different, so
Some child. Yeah.
some children would be able to get to stage faster than others.
Okay. Yeah. So are you talking about Kohlberg? I mean, who are you talking about, or all of them?
I mean, I guess all of them. I mean, Berkinson had the actual ages on there.
Yeah.
But also I think that some children possibly skip stages and then they come back to it. It's very rigid.
Interesting. Yeah, so you can, in theory, in your opinion, regress to some of these early psychosocial crises. That kind of fits in with like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yeah,
I would like to know, like, with Piaget's,
Piaget's.
Piaget's theory, so like with the ages he has right here, like in not being able to do like certain maths or like certain concepts at a certain age, I would like to know how he would explain like supernatural intelligence like young children, like children that go to college as teenagers or understand math at a really young age. We had in my 5th grade class, we had a guy already in algebra trig in 5th grade, and so I would like to know how he would explain how he skipped those steps.
Yeah, well, and that's one of, I think, the very legitimate concerns against sending people to college at a really young age. Because, I don't know in these specific examples if they've kind of developed that abstract thought, but I doubt it. It's most often the case that these kind of wonderkins are able to memorize things really easily and memorize the order to do things. But in theory, one of the most important parts about college is learning to kind of think abstractly, synthesize this information. But yeah, I don't know how Piaget kind of rectifies that of, okay, maybe it's something more than abstract thought that dictates your ability to perform out in the universe. Yeah?
This is kind of off topic, but with these stages, like when like people get old and have like Alzheimer's, do they not like kind of go back down the scale, like kind of start at 10 as a child?
That's really interesting. I don't know. Honest to God. So you're thinking about, let's see where we go. You're thinking specifically like within Erickson's model? Yeah, I mean, so I could see there being such a cognitive component about this that any sort of development of Alzheimer's or amnesia may cause somebody to kind of revert their mental model of how old they are and back to their way of thinking at that certain stage. But I don't know. It's really interesting. If you can find something about it, let me know. Yeah?
Like shortcoming of all of them, I think, is it assumes that everyone has approximately the same experiences at different ages.
Okay. Yeah. So the different experiences at different ages. Obviously, we've talked about things like neglect or abuse or malnutrition and what effects that has on different ages, different people. Yeah, I mean, I think you all are picking up on this absolutely, some of the major concerns. Also, when you think about, where are we here? One of the major concerns about Kohlberg's theory is that there are individual differences not accounted for by this, right? I mean, so men and women tend to have different moral philosophies that they've arrived to for whatever reason, but it's not necessarily appropriate from a logical stance to say that one has achieved a higher stage than the other because they're reliant on these different internal moral principles that can't explain kind of that same end conclusion. So, yeah, I mean, these are, frameworks. These are not necessarily statistical predictions of what you'll be. There's obviously going to be some gray in there. But yeah, I think y'all are picking up on some really compelling arguments against. And then also, it's important to notice that, we talk about these as if they're stages, which kind of evokes this imagery of steps. You get from one to the other. But in reality, it's kind of more of a continuum. It's not necessarily the case that you get to all stage 3 before you get to all stage 4. You can have this kind of gradation across the different stages. Any questions about these stages? Any of those developments? Cool. So the next thing we're going to talk about is parent-infant attachment. And every semester I feel compelled to say, I'm going to teach you things about different attachment styles, what that may mean when you were a kid, what it means for you in current relationships. However, individuals are always different, so if you have an avoidant attachment style, don't go back to mom and dad and say, you didn't love me in the right ways when I was a child. It may not be their fault, but this is kind of a compelling, universal looking at these group level differences. So, attachment itself is just an emotional tie with another person. Tends to be operationalized by children showing or seeking closeness to their caregivers or their parents, but also distress at separation. So removing that kid from their parents. And so you'll sometimes see this with stranger or separation anxiety, kids that really don't want to be held by anybody other than mom and or dad. So one of the primary ways, at least in the early stages, that this sort of parent-infant attachment develops is through body contact, right? And so, you know, you talk about, or you hear moms and dads talk about kind of this compelled desire to have sort of skin-to-skin contact or to hold their kids or things like that. That's one of the ways, kind of evolutionarily, we've been developing these sort of attachments. Interestingly enough, you'll also hear moms specifically talk about how they love the smell of their child's head, which sounds really strange, and they'll kiss the baby's head a whole bunch. There's actually a benefit to that, right? Because what the mom's doing by continuously kissing the baby's head is she's picking up any of the bacteria that the baby's exposed to, developing antibodies, and then passing it back to that child through breastfeeding. And so there are these kind of really interesting evolutionary adaptations for things that seem kind of strange on the surface, like I love the way a baby's head smells. So one of the early experiments looking at attachment was with monkeys. I'm going to show you maybe one of the saddest experiments ever done. There we go. So they took several different monkeys, separated the monkeys right after birth from their mother, and then presented different monkeys with different sorts of bodies. Don't need to be listening to all this. Where's the actual full example? There we go. And so they gave the monkey the option of kind of this wire, this cold feeling monkey that had the bottle, was able to feed that monkey. But you then see that the monkey's drawn to actually hanging out with this other monkey that has kind of a plush blanket on it, feels a little bit more like a primate, feels more like its mother would, even though there was no benefit of this other monkey other than kind of that feeling, that sensation. You can see that monkey's absolutely drawn to that kind of plush additional monkey. So mean. But you can see in this case where they scare the monkey, it's immediately drawn to that kind of feeling, that comfort associated with what I'm going to call like that blanket monkey. I told you it's sad. I know. I'll show you another one of a human baby later that also a true soul. Yeah, so we're not going to show the rest of that. But you start developing this understanding about how important this sort of body contact is for us evolutionarily, for different animals, right? And what they found is that that baby monkey would spend almost the entire day on that blanket mother, only leaving for the short amount of time it had to get fed, and then it came right back to that blanket mother. I think I got rid of it. They then kind of found, or they tracked these monkeys' developments into adulthood and found that the deprivation, so for some monkeys they didn't even give them that sort of plush mother blanket monkey. These are weird words to string together. But they found that those who were deprived of that sort of physical contact, that sort of bonding, grew up to be substantially more aggressive and, in fact, frequently also murderous of other monkeys. And so we'll talk about how that kind of pulls in to different attachment theories in a minute. But it's not necessarily the case that we always have a direct tie to the mother in these cases. Well, there's this phenomenon we call imprinting. And it's why you'll sometimes see adorable stories like, baby chicks that imprint with a dog as a mom, or imprint with a human, and they'll just follow them wherever. And it's this idea that you have sort of this kind of substitute for this maternal figure. They're latching on to whatever that sort of parental figure that's going to show them that affection, that physical body contact as well. And so we can think about the sort of attachment as being in two different bins: secure attachment or insecure attachment. So secure attachment can be evoked by these sort of sensitive and respondent mothers. So when we say respondent, we mean the baby's indicating that it's doing something and the mom is responding to that kid. And we're talking mostly about moms rather than dads. And this is not to say that there isn't some role for dads, but the early development, early attachment matters most with mothers. And so those who were those kind of sensitive, respondent mothers had babies that developed these sorts of secure attachments. However, insensitive, unrespondent mothers often had infants that became insecurely attached, and we'll talk about the second order ramifications of that in just a second. But here's another video. And this is simultaneously adorable, but also sad. So, here's a mother and her baby, and you'll see that the mom was told to interact in a very kind of responsive way. You'll see in a second points, and the mom reacts to the point of the child. They're developing sort of this communication, nonverbal communication, back and forth. And then, in the second stage, the mom was told to be completely unresponsive. And so she just stares at the child. The child picks up on something, right? This is not normal. But what you're going to start seeing is attempts of this child to evoke some sort of response from the mother. And when mom isn't responding, it creates a whole bunch of stress for this child. The kid starts getting fussy. And now starts pulling out kind of all these stops to get mom to respond to some degree. Right? When we think about these different reward cycles, or we think about positive and negative punishment and reward. And now you can see mom becomes a little bit more respondent, and the baby clearly becomes happy again. It's not a sad story. But you can see the obvious levels of stress that that baby was experiencing as a function of mom not providing any sort of responsive feedback, started pulling out all the stops, things that were working earlier, pointing, okay, that's not working, now I'm going to reach out and try to grab you, that's not working, now I'm going to screech a little bit, that's not working, all right, now I've pulled out everything, I'm just going to start crying, hoping that mom picks me up. And so secure attachments tend to lead to higher levels of basic trust. You tend to find that those who developed these secure attachment styles in infancy have greater friendships, have greater and more fulfilling relationships as adults. Those, however, who developed this sort of insecure attachment style can be broken into two specific categories: anxious attachment or avoidant attachment. So anxious attachment is this constant craving of acceptance, lead to this sort of constant fear over rejection. And this is one of the things that sometimes leads to somebody being quote-unquote clingy, right? Really clinging on to a relationship. Not wanting to perhaps be single, not wanting to have that partner leave them. other style, or excuse me, not style, the other category would be the sort of avoidant attachment. And so that's when people become kind of inherently uncomfortable with close relationships. They try to maintain distance, push people away. It also tends to lead to decreased commitment and increased conflict in romantic relationships. Because people with an avoidant attachment tend to push people away as things get too close or too vulnerable. Now again, there is this sort of like Psych 100 phenomena where anytime you talk about things like this, people want to go home and play therapist for their significant other or their best friends. Obviously things are a little more complex than just this. Don't go to your boyfriend and girlfriend and say, Mom must not have hugged you enough when you were a kid because you're pushing me away. Don't do that. But it is important to understand kind of some of these precursors that can lead to these sorts of attachment styles later in life. So another critical thinking, think about various TV shows or movies you've watched. Identify somebody who has secure attachment, a character that has secure attachment, and then identify someone who has insecure attachment. And with that insecure attachment, do they have anxious or avoidant attachment? You can talk with the neighbor, and then we will bring it all back together. So I mean, I also post the slides online.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, so under the files section, so you don't have to copy verbatim. Thirty-two more seconds. Character who seems to have a very secure attachment style. Lots of close friendships, healthy relationships. It's easier to think about those that are screwed up, isn't it? Yeah.
Ham and Jim from the office.
Ham and Jim, okay. Interesting. All right, so give me an example that you know they both have this sort of secure attachment style.
Well, compared to everyone else.
Compared to everyone else. Yes. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, so there are certain times where maybe Jim gets close to kind of this anxious attachment that he kind of veers away from, like when he was going to go surprise Pam because he thought she was cheating, things like that. But yes, yeah, that sort of secure attachment, great. Yeah, if we could do this all in terms of the office, that'd be great. The hell was that?
I think it was my chair squeaking.
Wow, that was impressively loud. Sorry, I didn't mean to single you out. I thought we were all about to die or something. All right, give me an example of a character that has an insecure attachment style. Yes. Kelly, yes. Awesome. We're going to keep this ball rolling. And which one would she fit into? The sort of anxious attachment or avoidant? Anxious. Yes. And Ryan tends to have that sort of avoidant, which makes them such a comical pair between the two of them. She wants, for those of y'all who haven't seen, Kelly really clings on to Ryan. Ryan wants nothing to do with Kelly, but he keeps going back, and yeah, the end. Just watch the show. This entire class could be taught with Office episodes. So, all right, give me another example. Yeah.
That's from the cartoon, Zanini from the old Cartoon Network show, Chowder.
Okay, I haven't seen it. So how do you know this person has an insecure attachment style?
Because she's obsessed with the main character on the whole stock level.
Okay, so yeah, having this really sort of anxious, please don't go away from me, I'll do anything you want. Yes. What was the name of the show again?
Chowder.
Chowder? Check it out. Give me one other example. Yeah. Okay, and which type of insecure attachment style does he have? Avoidant, yes. Which breaks my heart when I've had several ex-girlfriends tell me I'm like Ron Swanson. Yeah, that's not good. But yes, this very avoidant personality, and maybe divulging too much, this avoidant personality issue wherein, to Ron's own words, he likes to call people the wrong name anytime they get too chummy with him so they know he doesn't care about them. Yeah. Yeah.
Dennis from It's Always Sunny.
Dennis from It's Always Sunny. Yes, very avoidant, doesn't want anybody getting in close. Yes, y'all are doing a good job. So now you can go home and watch TV, and I will have ruined TV for you because you can start thinking about the backstory of each of these characters and whose mommy didn't hug them quite enough. All right, so we have talked about neglect and abuse before, some of the issues that arise from that, but also thinking about neglect and abuse from an emotional standpoint, right? Being this sort of unresponsive mother, although being unresponsive alone is not enough to do substantial damage, so don't worry if any of y'all want to have kids. You're not going to screw them up that bad. Neglect and abuse can actually lead to lower IQs, right? So we talk about the environment and gene interactions, reduced brain development, abnormal stress responses, and up to 4 times the rate of ADHD as those without. Here was where I was looking for earlier. So Harlow's monkeys had lasting effects. So when you took these monkeys that didn't have this sort of bonding or ability to develop that sort of secure attachment, they tended to lash out when you put them with other monkeys. They often couldn't mate with other monkeys because of this sort of insecure attachment. But even when artificially impregnated, the females were often neglectful, abuseful, or even murderous of their young. And again, we've talked about these kind of cycles of abuse and why these can be so hard to get out of, but neglect and abuse can lead to neglect and abuse of your own offspring. Now again, that is not to say if you grew up in an abusive childhood, you're going to abuse your children, but it does suggest that there's an increased risk of that for a variety of bio, psycho, and social reasons. And this is also one of the things that tends to be pointed out anytime you have these sort of mass murderers or these very antisocial, and again, we're not using antisocial in the I don't like social settings, antisocial in the sense that I am doing direct harm to people in society, but tend to have experienced unbelievable levels of neglect or abuse when they were children, when they were growing up. And again, this doesn't mean it's predictive. Some of the most loving people I know, some of those with the most beautiful relationships with their own children, are those who I know were severely beaten or neglected when they were children. So again, this is not saying that this is the way your life is going to play out based off of whether you had a good or bad childhood, but it is saying this leads to an increased likelihood of these things happening. And being cognizant of it allows you to identify it for yourself and others. So now let's really kind of go into this very fine-grained look at the development for the first about year and a half is what we'll get through. From a social and emotional, a language, communication. We're also going to talk about the cognitive and then the motor or the movement controls as well. But at about 2 months for a newborn, children begin to smile at people. You'll notice that any smiling that happens before 2 months tends to be tied to something like a bowel movement. As weird as that is to say, it's true, and we'll talk about, Freud's different theories about these psychosexual stages. Babies are able to also start calming themselves at 2 months. They can do things like start sucking on their finger or putting their foot in their mouth. They'll also start trying to look at the parent. So the visual system, one of the side effects of not having a fully developed cortex at birth means that the visual system is really kind of crude when the baby's first born. And so they're not actually able to resolve many things. It'll develop over time, and you can start to see how far away a child's able to resolve information. But the child will start trying to look at their parent during interactions. You also have these very kind of rudimentary orientations towards sound. So something happens in the environment and the kid knows to now look at that. It's also where you start seeing some of the early developments of what will eventually become speech. So you have these sort of coos and gurgling sounds. From a cognitive perspective, kids start paying attention to faces. They start understanding that faces matter, and we'll see that in terms of recognition later on and favoritism. They're now able to start tracking things with their eyes. As things move in their environment, their visual system has developed to a point where it allows them to have kind of this smooth pursuit, this actual tracking of the object as it moves through. They're able to start recognizing people at distances, although it's very crude at this point. And then from a movement perspective, they're starting being able to hold their head up. And this is also when you'll start seeing them kind of start pushing up when they're laying on their stomach. One of my colleagues in the psych department has a 9-month-old. And if I had thought about it, I would have brought him in and just let him play around and let us all understand that. If I can't bring dogs, I can bring the second best thing. At 4 months, there starts to be this sort of spontaneity in smiling, especially at people. And they'll also start copying various movements and facial expressions. So smiling at a kid is more likely to make them smile. Again, when we talked about the appraisal of emotions, one of the things you can do with really young kids is when they get hurt, if you smile at them, which sounds like a really perverse and maniacal thing to do, but smile at them, they tend not to react as negatively to that pain as if you were to appear scared or startled. You then start getting a little bit of this babbling, so less of the coos and gurgles. There are initial attempts to try to copy the sounds that the baby hears. There's also this development of unique cries in response to different sensations, so hunger, pain, exhaustion, etc. They also tend to start really responding to affection. It's also where you start getting kind of this hand-eye coordination. They're able to start reaching out to objects with a single hand. Part of that also means they're starting to understand this kind of parapersonal space. One thing you'll see really young infants do is reach out for things that they obviously can't grab. Like obvious to us, not obvious to them. Once they start developing this hand-eye coordination, that becomes more skilled. There's a recognition of familiar people and things at distances. Yeah?
So I read an article, I forget exactly what research on, but it was a study on people who were born without sight, and then through surgery or some other mechanism were then able to see. They go through the same several year process that newborn babies do.
Interesting. At what ages, do you remember?
They studied several different groups of people. Some were early teens, some were late 40s.
Interesting.
Originally, there was kind of anticlimactic. How is the sight thing you talk about any useful to me at all? Because they had no ability to categorize things on the screen.
Yeah. And so there's this really interesting book called Crashing Through. And it was a guy who, when he was a child, had acid fall off of a shelf and scarred his corneas. And so he couldn't see. He never really developed. I mean, there's a little bit of a development in the first stages right after he was born. But for decades didn't have any sight. And this book kind of details that relearning process of what does this visual information mean. Things weren't popping out. It was like everything was just kind of like two-dimensional. And so starting to learn these contrasts and how do you move about your environment. There's a really famous study, I don't know if we talked about it in here, called the Kitten Carousel, where they put one cat on one side of a carousel where it wasn't able to move, and another cat on the other side of a carousel where it was able to move, and the cat that was able to move started learning to map their actions and the consequences of their actions on their visual input. And the cat that wasn't able to do that, but just had the same visual input, never learned to interact with its environment, would run around and bump into things because it hadn't actually developed that sort of mapping. But that's tangential. They're able to hold their head steady. They're also starting to be able to roll. And then in response to their legs hitting a hard surface, they tend to push back, which is going to be important as we start looking at their ability to stand and walk. At 6 months, they start knowing familiar faces. So it's not that everybody is a stranger anymore. They like to play with others, so you get this really kind of interest in play or activities. And then responding to other people's emotions. So people who are happy, they respond with happiness. Those who are sad, they tend to respond with sadness. And this is also where you start getting kind of some of the early semblance of communication and language by the kids responding with sounds when they have sounds uttered towards them. And this is why sometimes you'll get those cute videos of those really, really young kids that are just, and it looks like they're having a conversation with each other, but they're not saying anything. They're just kind of babbling back and forth. But they're like, it's almost like they think they're having a conversation. They're able to start stringing these vowels together. They understand kind of these early stages of semantic development. And at 6 months, they start responding to their own name. They've learned that that name has some sort of meaning. We'll start looking around at things nearby. This is also when you start getting everything that goes right into the mouth. right? We've talked about the somatosensory cortex in here and why babies, to make sense of their world, put everything in their mouth, right? And so this is the age where everything starts going right in the mouth. They start showing curiosity in things, and they're able to start passing things back and forth from one hand to the other. They can now start rolling over in both directions, not just one. They can sit without support, and they can also support their weight on their legs. So if you put them up and prop them on a table, not prop them on a table, but against a table, they're able to maintain their weight standing up. Running out of time here. At 9 months, they start understanding this sort of fear of strangers. This is also where you start getting some of that clingy behavior to familiar adults. They'll have things like favorite toys. So again, they're understanding the uniqueness and the distinction between these objects. This is also where they start to finally understand the word no. So for the first 9 months, telling a kid not to do something is an exercise in frivolity. There's copying of the sounds and gestures of others. And this is also where you start getting them pointing and trying to orient people to things in their environment. This is where you start getting things like object permanence, so looking for things that you've hidden from them. Does coincide with playing the peekaboo game. And then there's this development of fine motor skills. So for example, being able to pick up Cheerios with a thumb and index finger. They'll also tend to be able to kind of pull themselves to standing. So they'll go over to a table and be able to pull themselves up so they're now standing. This will also be where they start crawling around. My coworker was telling me like I said, her son is 9 months old, and they've started putting barricades in their house to prevent the kid from going one direction, but the kid started to understand that it can go the other way, and has started crawling around the backside and getting to the other side where the kid's not supposed to be before mom notices. You have this sort of social and emotional development, so crying when mom and dad leave, having favorite things and people at this year old. Language and communication, they start responding to simple requests. They understand simple gestures, like shaking their head, meaning no. This is also where you'll sometimes see parents start teaching their kids how to sign things, like things like this, meaning more. And so you'll sometimes see kids out of restaurants doing this, indicating that they want more of whatever mom and dad just fed them. You'll also start getting them to say their first word, like mama, dada, and also things like uh-oh. An adorable example of this was my former advisor in grad school. His daughter understood that uh-oh meant something that kind of corresponded to what society didn't want, but not that it corresponded to things that you individually didn't want. So she would do things like, uh-oh. It's like it very clearly was not an accident, but would do things very deliberately and say, uh-oh. They would then also start trying to actually mimic the words you say, so learning that language. They'll understand what something is by its name, so you can mention it, and the kid will look at the thing. They'll find things that are hidden very easily. They'll also start using things for their intended purpose, like understanding that cups are for drinking, that brushes are for brushing your hair. This is also where they'll start really exploring their environment, little scientists, by shaking things and banging things against other things, throwing objects. They'll start walking by kind of holding on to furniture and walking around. They can also start standing on their own. And then you get these different years. So at 2 years, they're able to start following two-step directions. So it's not just a single instruction, but it's things like pick up your shoes and put them in the closet. They can start playing simple make-believe games. 3 years is where we start getting the understanding of prepositions, so on, under, around, behind, things like that. Understanding the differences, the semantic differences between I, we, me, you. At 4 years, that's that development of an understanding of time. But again, it's not necessarily that time means anything. 1 day and a year to a kid seem like the same thing. They start understanding the difference between things that are the same and things that are different, understanding these sort of comparisons. They're also able to start projecting into the future. Okay, what's going to happen next in a story or book? How are we doing here? All right. Any questions about what we covered today? I don't know if baby fever for men is a real thing, but putting together this lecture, it's like, these babies are adorable. I think we've got baby fever. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or come talk to me. Otherwise, I will see you all on Thursday.